picked to brainstorm how can we breed these things in captivity. Went back to Cornell early on. So he was part of the Peregrine Fund virtually from its inception. He's the director today. He's been with us on that side. When the excrement hit the oscillator here a while back and the Peregrine went down the drain, he was one of those scientists who stood up and said he was a falconer. Never tried to hide that behind him. Never tried to pretend he was anything else like Tom Kay. He got up, I'm a falconer, and this is how it is. This is how these birds are. Never let it get in the way. Never tried to hide it behind the bush. Love me, love my hawking. He's been a friend of Napa's. He's been a friend of the Peregrines. And he's been a friend of falconer. I don't know what his connections are in Louisiana. That's a little strange. But those guys down there started a thing called the No Mercy Hawking Club. And they must have had Enderson in mind when it comes to ducks and the dowdy from. I don't know how old Dowdy is now, 10 years, maybe 9 years? But Enderson has been doing terrible things to the Pacific or the Western Central Flyway of ducks with an old peregrine for an awful long time. And you talk about no mercy. There is a real hawker. If you adopt me, ask his wife. We're really lucky to have a guy like Enderson. Like I say, he's been a friend to all of us. Most of all, I'm really tickled he's been a friend of mine. Thanks, Jim. Come up.
Thanks, Ken. That's a real nice thing to say. It's an honor for us to be here today. Falconry really is about people, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I spent a lot of money on raffle tickets tonight, so I'm going to let any of these slides go for a buck apiece. Except the one of Webster, it's going to be $20, and when you see it, I'll ask you why. No, I'm just teasing, but I'll ask you about Webby's picture. So we could have the projector. I'll take you through a brief run of what has happened to the Peregrines and something who made it interesting. Ralph, you'll have to move that projector around to number 1 slide. It's on number 7 right now. Press that, set it back. Take it back in history a little bit. Back in the 50s, kestrels were the center of the universe. There were no falconers around at all in northern Illinois. Only a couple of copies of National Geographic, I saw them back there on the table, and hawks in the hand. What we really were interested in doing was robbing nests. We wanted kestrels. And we always wanted more, so we started counting nests, and this is where the business of counting for me began. Next picture. As you well know, there are always nests too far, too high. So we experimented with different techniques. Next slide. Rope ladders were a problem. I don't advise rope ladders. We've never gone back to them. Fortunately, at the end of the 50s, I bumped into a couple of people quite accidentally. Next slide. Frank Beebe on the left, the character Don Hunter on the right. Don Hunter, as you probably know, is responsible largely for the formation of the Rapid Research Foundation. And in the early 60s, 62 I believe, they took me to the Queen Charlotte's. Now what Hunter is telling Beebe here is that this old piece of hemp rope is not strong enough for a man the size of Don Hunter. We'll let Enderson go over the cliffs. The first peregrine I ever saw was in the Queen Charlotte's, and it is a mecca for anyone interested in this species. You must go there if you haven't been there. It's still always a mecca. Next slide. A few years earlier, I'd become interested in peregrines. In 1957, I went to this cliff in Union County, Illinois. It's across from Cape Girardeau, if you know where that is, in Missouri. This cliff had been an active peregrine site for many years, probably a part of that southern population of peregrines. It was vacant in 1957, and that was the tip of the iceberg. Many of the cliffs in that part of the world became vacant about then, and we were soon to find out why. Next. This is the slide that would go for $20. All through this career working with peregrines, there are people who were around to remind me how important falconry is. It's easy to slip away from falconry. I let it happen to myself for a few years, but coming back is important, so you don't want to let this happen. And if you surround yourself with characters like this, you'll keep interested in falconry. You know why this slide is worth $20? You're on. Exactly. Hell's got hair. In fact, there's several under that head. Next slide. Last year, we were invited to put together a paper that would summarize everything that's happened to peregrines, their early status, the decline, and the recovery. I invited Bill Heinrich from the Peregrine Fund and Lloyd Kiff of the Western Foundation for Vertebrate Zoology, now the Peregrine Fund, and Clay White to help me, because they had also been counters in their life, and they knew people who counted peregrines' nests. This paper was really the result of the work of a lot of field people. There are a lot of people out there counting peregrines. We never really got caught up in this business of counting, but I'll try to bring you up to speed now, next. As you all know, there were supposedly 3 races of peregrines in North America. The bird on the left is the tundra peregrine. It was by far the most abundant of the 3 subspecies. The one in the center was second most abundant. That's the bird of the interior. That one happens to be a Colorado-type peregrine. They were also in the eastern United States, as you know. And the one over on the left was the rarest of all peregrines, probably numbering only 1,000 or so pairs total. That's the Peel's falcon. That happens to be a male on the left. Next slide shows the same 3 birds in adult plumage. The one in the center was Lil, an early breeder, eventually a breeder of mine, and one of the few birds to breed, one of the few birds caught as a wild bird, not an eyas, known to breed. Next. The problem, of course, were thin-shelled eggs. The eggs were thin-shelled and they dented. Next slide. Production fell, mortality exceeded production, and places like this, the upper Mississippi River, this is real important, Wisconsin, everybody will probably know where this is. Places like this, a population perhaps of 40 or 50 pairs of peregrines in this region were gone, almost to the last bird by 1964. Next. Derek Ratcliffe in Britain in the early 60s realized that peregrine eggs weren't as strong as they used to be. He gathered a lot of eggs from collectors, measured their thickness, and this is what he found. In 1945, there was a sudden change in the thickness of eggshells in Europe. Notice there's high variation, even when the eggs were normal, prior to the use of the pesticide DDT. Next, please. We found out where the DDT was coming from. This is a brewer's blackbird turned to mush. Makes great hors d'oeuvres if you've got a little left over. The organochlorine materials were mainly DDT and its breakdown products, DDE. And DDE, so far as I know, is the only material that's been linked without refute to the eggshell thinning problem that these birds faced. Next. In 1964, Joe Hickey sent Dan Berger and Chuck Sindelar to over 160 eyries in the eastern United States. All they found was a little whitewash in protected places on some cliffs in New Hampshire. The bird was caught. Next. Not quite. In 1970, Walter Spofford and I, on the tip from an ornithologist, a bird watcher, found a single adult peregrine on this cliff at Willoughby Lake in New Hampshire, 1970. This bird was the sole survivor, surviving on longevity alone, of a once large eastern population. Next. In the West, the situation wasn't much better. The first eyrie known, published in Colorado was Chimney Rock between Durango and Pagosa Springs. It fell into disuse in 1974. I have to tell you, it's reoccupied. Next. We gathered all of the data we could on historical sites that were known to science in general, and Falconers as well, in 1975. Had they collected all of the information available, they would have seen this picture. Notice the tundra and the taiga peregrines, the taiga being those birds nesting in the northern boreal forest, were the most abundant, or I should say had the highest occupancy rate. In 1975, the North American Survey checked around 230 eyries in the north, and they found something on the order of 90-some pairs present, for an occupancy rate varying between 32 and 40%. In temperate regions, the situation was much worse. Notice in the east and Midwest, the bird was effectively gone. And finally, in the western United States, something on the order of 14 to 15% of the eyries were still occupied. There was a time here when only 8 pairs could be found in all of California and only 6 in all of Colorado, both states well known and well searched. Next. If you look at all of the historical records for North America that were available in 1975, it should be quite obvious that the Arctic was not very well known at all. Only 196 historical sites known in the Arctic, and there must have been literally thousands, as you will see. In the United States, Alaska was fairly well known because of the work of Tom Cade in the early 1960s and late 1950s. In the East, 215 historical eyries known because Joe Hickey in 1944 had gathered all of that historical information together for the East United States. The Midwest, only 60 pairs were known. It was not ideal peregrine country. And the next slide, next, shows a closer look at the West. California was well known because of the work of Richard Bond, who published just after Joe Hickey in 1945. The other states were poorly known. Texas, for example, most of those pairs were known along the Rio Grande, the Big Bend region. In all, these 304 pairs, plus all of the others known in North America, numbered only about 1,200 pairs. No surprise, then, that people would think that the peregrine is, in fact, a rare bird, or at least was a rare bird, even prior to the decline. Next. More encouragement to remain in falconry. You know these fellows, Eric Allender, there's Dan Cobra on the right. They showed up in Colorado Springs in 1962, intrepid falconers. I was inspired by it. Next. This is the last peregrine known to nest on the high plains of Montana and Alberta. This picture was taken in 1974. That's Dan Berger. We banded the bird, and Richard Fife found it nesting 2 more years. In 1976, it disappeared, and as far as I know, that's the last of a fairly large population that nested on the rich, bird-rich high plains of southern Canada and central United States. Next. At that time, people came out of the woodwork because they were vitally interested in peregrines. The guy leaning over me here is a fellow by the name of John Campbell. And he was the first of a small group of private people who began to breed peregrines and see the need to breed peregrines in captivity. This picture was actually taken on a trip to rob nests. Next. The captive peregrines we had were a mixed lot. Many of them were imprinted on people. They hated other peregrines. They laid eggs. They were infertile. Next. Peregrines copulate after a long flight, approaching flight by males. We thought perhaps more room was necessary, so bigger cages were necessary. Next. Bob Berry built this massive enclosure in Pennsylvania. Turned out not to be necessary once we got the right birds. Next. Artificial insemination became an important tool. We tracked prairie falcons first and then worked on peregrines. I don't do this anymore, but I've told people that at one time I got fairly good at it. I was known as Magic Fingers Enderson, and I could get sperm out of almost anything. Later, next slide, shows Dan Conkle, another hero of this early saga, using Les Boyd's technique, where an imprinted male is trained to copulate with a hat. It looks kinky, but it isn't. I've actually gone under the hat, and it's sort of fun. This is BC, whose genetic information is scattered all over western United States. This was an early male that I took in Colorado in 1971. Next. The first Rocky Mountain peregrine produced in captivity was this bird, Alpha, in 1973. Next. In 1974, the decline continued. The site in Billings, Montana fell into disuse. And only 2 years later, as I said before, the site north of there in Alberta became vacant. Next. The Cornell group, Tom Cade and Jim Weaver and others, joined with the Colorado Division of Wildlife and built this facility at Fort Collins. The first barn on the left was given to the Peregrine Fund, actually the Peregrine Fund through the National Audubon Society from the estate of a man who believed he would be reincarnated as a bird. Probably was a robin that got eaten by the first released peregrine. I don't know. The Peregrine Fund was at this facility until through the season of 1984. Next. More inspiration. If you haven't gone duck hawking with Ranger Hunt, you haven't lived. His famous motto, well, let's go hawking. If you know Ranger, you know what that sounds like. Next. By 1978, there were enough peregrines to begin meaningful management. Next slide. The Canadians weren't left behind. Richard Fife, Ursula Banish, Phil Tracy, and others put together this facility at Wainwright. And I'll show you its results shortly. Next. Well, here they are. We tallied last year all of the production by the major facilities of peregrines in North America. The Santa Cruz facility, up to 92 when they shut down, produced 449. University of Saskatchewan, Lynn Oliphant's group, 264. The Wainwright facility by Richard Fife, the Canadian Wildlife Service, around 1,500, as close as Ursula could figure. And the Peregrine Fund and the various facilities, many more, for a total of about 5,400 birds. And I have to tell you that by 1994, something on the order of another 800 had been produced by private, smaller breeders in what you might call backyard facilities, some of them more elaborate than others. Next. This was not really a good time, though, when this breeding was going on. I had one of the last permits to take a tundra peregrine from the Texas coast. We thought perhaps tundra birds might, in captivity, produce eggs. They never did if they were wild caught. But anyway, in 1972, I had a permit, and I was aware for the first time of a vast horde of policemen watching what I was doing. A decade later, a little more than a decade later, all of this would surface as an Operation Falcon. They were out there then, and they're out there now. Next. One of the people really humiliated by Operation Falcon to the point where he had to retire is Richard Fife, a real hero. Next. There was a new generation of young people coming along. I happen to have this slide of Jack Stoddard. And who's that guy in the center? Yeah, Buddy Craver from Colorado Springs. They became backyard falconers, and they've kept with it ever since. It's been fun to be associated with people like that. Next. This guy was a major inspiration in terms of how you do falconry. That's Ken Riddle on the left. With a hybrid, it turns out, on the right. Riddle was an airman at the Air Force Academy, and the crack of his whip sent many ducks to their doom. Next. That's how we got them off the pond. The first release was in Colorado in 1974. We found broken eggshells in the peregrine eyrie at the Royal Gorge. Put 2 prairie falcon eggs in the eyrie. They hatched, and here we're swapping the 2 young prairies for 2 peregrines produced in 1974. At that time, only about 15 or 20 peregrines had been produced in captivity in the United States. But 2 were put in 1974. Jim Weaver brought them out. Can you tell which are the peregrines and which are the prairies? Prairies in the background. Peregrines have down long enough so you can't see their ear canals. Next. Releases were by hack. Next. From either mountaintops or from towers and marshes. This happens to be Assateague Island. Next. In California and Colorado, a lot of the releases were done by fostering. We take the eggs from peregrines, incubate them artificially, after replacing them with dummies, then later providing a new full brood to young birds. Imagine the adults coming back and seeing these youngsters in their nests where only moments before there had been dummy eggs. Next. The total figures on releases up until 1994 are slightly staggering. In Canada, something on the order of 1,500 plus peregrines released until 1994, and in the United States, many more, for a total of almost a little over 6,200 peregrines were released. About 80% of those, by the way, survived to independence. About 80%. The 510 birds shown there are included in that 6,200 figure. They represent wild-taken eggs, hatched in captivity and then hacked or fostered to wild adults, mainly California and Colorado. Next. The data on population change are interesting. In the East and in the Midwest, there were no peregrines. Both these populations are human-made populations. The eastern population began to grow earlier because the releases began in the late 70s, and those in the Midwest somewhat later. The data for the Midwest was supplied by Pat Redding and Bud Tordoff, the 2 engineers of this remarkable establishment of a peregrine population. Next. Peregrines became urban. They're famous now in cities. It turns out that in temperate North America, north of Mexico, 1 in 10 pairs of peregrines is urban. 1 in 10. Next. Across the northern tier of western states, peregrines were virtually extirpated by 1975. These are the trends for their numbers. Those for Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana are essentially human-made populations like that in the Midwest and the East. Those in Oregon and Washington were built upon small, pre-existing populations. Next. These are people who made it happen. Jerry Craig was responsible for diverting large amounts of federal and state money into peregrine restoration. And that's a major achievement. Bill Burnham, of course, was the architect of much of the eastern releases. He couldn't have done it alone, and there were a bunch of heroes around with Bill. And the guy behind the camera is Morley Nelson. If you've been around Morley Nelson, you know this is the guy that says, "Attaboy, let's go for it." Next. California population, under the guidance of Brian Walton and his group, grew rapidly. The Colorado population did not grow very rapidly despite very careful surveys. Both in Colorado and in California, wild birds were also producing eggs. About 700 birds were released in California. About 900 were hatched naturally at the same time. In Colorado, about 500 birds were released, and about 600 hatched naturally at the same time. So those growths are due to both processes, the natural reproduction and the release. The growth of poor Utah is largely a result of massive extension of search. The more you look, the more you find. Next slide. And this is how you look. You put together teams of people who know what they are doing, and you find some Vietnam veterans, they'll put a helicopter anywhere. Next slide. And I mean anywhere. And they discovered a massive population down in Colorado from Moab. Maybe 200, 300 pairs minimum to Lake Mead. Next. And about that time, this was the mid-'80s, some places in Alberta, once vacant, were being reoccupied. This is a dirt bank on the Saskatchewan River. There are peregrines here now. Next. Peregrines do well reproductively even if there's pesticides around. 3.5 eggs is the normal clutch size. And it turns out that about 2.5 hatch. I didn't have the vision to show you what 2.5 look like. And about 1.5 fledged. There are very few places for reproduction. It seems less than normal. The search extended to the north. Bill Burnham on the left, Clayton White, Tom Cade in his younger days. And that guy over on the right is a falconer, Bob Martin, whose John Wayne is wonderful if you've never heard it. Next. These are data for the Arctic, the tundra regions. The Colville River is probably the best known. The Canadians have studied Rankin Inlet, the copper mine, Hope Bay. The data are all up, 3 to 4-fold increase since 1975 over there on the left. Next. The interior of Canada, the taiga, is easy to look at in certain areas. Along the Peace River, the cliffs are close to the water. Next slide. But on the Mackenzie, the cliffs of the basin are far back from the water. The data show that if you get a helicopter into that country, you start finding peregrines. Next picture. That top curve is for the Mackenzie River. Once you start looking with helicopters, peregrines come out of the woodwork. The best data, though, probably are for the Yukon in terms of what was really happening population-wise. That's the lower line. About a 3-fold increase. Next. At that time, people diverted some of their interest from peregrines. This is Bob Berry. He got into gerfalcons early, and he's still there, and along with orange-breasted falcons. This slide was taken in 1970. And by the way, Berry is probably best known for his work on artificial insemination by those who are really on the inside. Artificial insemination with goshawks, of all things. Next. Of course, the migrants might be a telltale clue as to what was happening to northern populations. Next slide. The person really, that's Betty on the left, but the person really responsible for organizing counts of migrant peregrines in North America was this guy called Scott Ward. He diverted lots of money from the Department of Defense to work on peregrines. He was followed more recently by Bill Seeger, Mike Yates, names you might know, and Tom Meckley, who's worked a lot on Padre Island. Their data, by the way, are excellent. Next slide. We were able to standardize data from 3 different places in terms of observer hours. Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, Hawk Mountain, and Assateague. The Assateague population increased about 3-fold from 1970 to 1990. That is, the counts, when standardized, went up about 3-fold during that period, recovery period. Those for Cedar Grove went up 4-fold. And the Hawk Mountain counts, when standardized carefully, show a 5-fold increase in the sightings of peregrines up through 1993. Next. So what we did was to, next, add up all the peregrines that have been counted over the decades, make an estimate for 94, and see how it all looked. This is for Canada and Greenland. The top 3 lines are for Canada, North, Pacific, and South. Notice that the counts in 1994 of 376 fall far short of what certainly must be there, 4,100 pairs of birds. The southern part of Canada still is fairly short on peregrines, temperate Canada that is, and we estimate no more than about 55 pairs there. That's where the shortfall still falls in Canada. The Greenland counts are due in part to increasing search effort, and the total estimate of 450 pairs in West Greenland is probably on the ultra-conservative side. Maybe 600 or 700 pairs is more reasonable. Next. This is the United States, and this is particularly the interior birds now. We're talking about Anata. In Alaska, in 1994, 183 pairs, assuming that those in the lower Yukon found in the early 90s are still there, and there's no reason to think they're not. In the eastern United States, an estimate of 120 pairs in 1994. In the Midwest, 60 pairs. By the way, those two numbers summed, 120 and 60, is in fact the recovery goal for the Eastern Recovery Plan for the Midwest and the East. In the West, the estimate of 914 pairs, which is very conservative, is about twice the recovery goal for the peregrine in the Western United States, about twice. Next. Then we compared just 2 estimates of 2 counts of peregrine, 1 count and an estimate of peregrines in North America. Our counts for 1994 add up to about, our estimates for 1994 add up to about 7,200 pairs of peregrines. There probably were, before the decline, somewhere around 7,600 pairs, but it could be more than that. The shortfall is mainly in temperate North America. That is, the Eastern United States, the Midwest, and probably the northern tier of Western states have not yet quite fully recovered to maximum. Next. If you want to know how many peregrines there are in North America, we did a little bit of fun calculation. The 7,600 pairs, how many there were in North America, or let's see, how many there are in North America, we took the 7,600 pairs, multiplied them by 2, you end up with 15,200 adult birds, at least 8,000 juveniles produced each year, depending on when you count, of course. It all adds up to 23,000 birds, roughly. I mentioned that to Ian Newton a couple of weeks ago, and he looked at, I expected him to be very excited and surprised. He looked at me and said, rather few than Europe, eh? It turns out that their estimate is something on the order of 35,000 peregrines in Europe, including Scotland, England, and Britain, and all of Central and Eastern and Western Europe. So this is a fairly common bird now. If anybody asks, you say roughly there's somewhere between 22 and 25,000 peregrines on the North American continent, talking about individuals. Next. In Scotland, the population is becoming enormous. They nest in places like this. Next slide. And they look like this in the eyrie. And if you look closely at the foot of this bird, see at a glance why there are now at least 50% more peregrines in Britain than before the decline. Next slide. This is what they eat. It's a human-maintained population. It's inadvertent, of course. Next. Well, what do you do when you've got lots of peregrines and when they're back? Well, you study them some more. You can't give up now. A couple of years ago, we put radio transmitters on peregrines nesting along the Front Range of Colorado. Next slide. This is Scott Francis, some of you know him from California, a falconer. They're always woven through this fabric. Releasing this adult bird, and we track them. Next slide. And next slide. And we found a very interesting result. We track individual birds on individual hunts. And the hunts began at the eyrie, went out to feeding grounds, and then returned. 2 or 3 trips a day. That's 40 miles. One way, 40 miles. These are solar-powered birds. They thermal up, set their wings at 45 degrees, reach 60, 70 miles an hour and they're there. Next. They hunt over home ranges that are enormous. This is again south of Colorado Springs. That elliptical circle includes the 95% harmonic mean for all of our fixes on this particular female. It encloses over 370 square miles of habitat. Better rethink what critical habitat means to peregrines. They're thinly spread across the land. All of their ranges overlap, by the way. They probably never saw each other. Next. The most exciting thing that's happened recently is I fell into cahoots with a guy there with his hat on backwards. His name is Vance Tucker from Duke. He's invented a machine that I call the aviometer. It's based on a World War II artillery rangefinder. It feeds range, lateral windage, and elevation into transducers that offload into a desktop computer. He offloads the desktop computer then into a big machine that does the calculated geometries, and it calculates in real space every half second the position of a bird in real space, and so you can determine its velocity. A peregrine flapping in a shallow, high-speed run, beginning of its dive, is good for about 80 miles an hour. As long as the wings are out, that's about as fast as they can go. But when they close up their wings, they go at least twice as fast. The top speed is so far is yet unclassified. Stay tuned. That next and last slide. No, this is not the last slide. There will be a couple more. The peregrine is out of the woods, returning to condors. Within a matter of a couple of months, with any luck at all, if we can get around the bureaucrats, there will be a release of condors in Arizona, Grand Canyon country. A second release. There are also, right now, about 8 condors flying free in California. Total population is now over 90, up from what was it, 29, the low point, something like that. Next slide. This program is headed up largely in terms of the releases by Bill Heinrich, who is a hero of the peregrine work, along with a lot of other people, Jimmy Weaver, Willard Heck, Cal Sanford, there are lots of them, Dan Conwell. And I suspect that we'll see condors in the sky before long. And the last slide. This is a peregrine coming head on. All that I've said about peregrines tonight probably is not good news to things like robins, doves, white-throated swifts, but that's their problem. They've dealt with them for centuries, they can deal with them again. Thanks a whole lot.